When I first pulled into my driveway after a long day at work, I caught a glimpse of it. A snowman, standing proudly in the center of my front yard. I stepped out of my car and trudged through the ankle-high snow that had fallen the night before. I walked up to the rotund creation and examined it. It appeared to be just your average snowman. 2 charcoal eyes, a carrot for a nose, charcoal buttons on its chest, 2 small sticks protruding out from its side and adorned with some worn-out mittens. Whoever had made this had some skill molding snow. I smiled, thinking back to the simpler times of my life. Times when I was young and unfettered by the worldly restraints I'm accustomed to now. Bills, work, and stress now occupied my life. I thought back to when my friends and I would each build snowmen together, have snowball wars, not fights, and play in the frigid wonderland until the sun would abandon us. It was nice to see children still doing the same stuff I used to do as a kid during the winter months. After a moment, my phone rang in my pocket, and I rifled my gloves in an attempt to fish it out. Once free, I answered it. It was my boss, reminding me to finish typing up my reports for the next day. I thanked him for the call and returned the phone to my pocket. As I did, I noticed something odd at the base of the snowman in front of me. There were no footprints near it. Apart from my own, that is. I peeked around him, but there were no signs of anyone else being here. I figured it must have snowed a bit more while I was at work, and made my way inside my house. Stepping through my front door, I was greeted to an equally chilly atmosphere, as I had forgotten to turn on my heater when I left for work. I kicked the snow from my shoes and danced over to the thermostat, cranking it as high as I could. I heard the heater rumble to life through the walls, and not long after, the warm air began to circulate throughout my house. I grabbed myself a beer and booted up my PC. While I waited for everything to turn on, I glanced outside my window. Snow was starting to fall once again. I sighed as I sipped my drink. I was never particularly fond of the winter, more so as an adult, but it was just a part of life. I looked over and saw the snowman once again. He was still out there, standing guard as it were. I wondered if the children who made him would come back and make another. My computer finally finished its boot sequence and I began working. It felt like hours had gone by while I entered seemingly countless numbers into spreadsheets, though when I looked at the clock, only 45 minutes had passed. I let out an even heavier sigh than before and rubbed my eyes. I leaned back in my chair and looked out my window once again. Though when I did this time, I noticed something different. The snowman wasn't there. I rose from my chair and walked over to the window. It was a bit difficult to see through the snow, but after a moment of scanning, I found it. It was about 6 feet to the left of its original spot. Or at least, I thought it was. I stared at it carefully, wondering if it had even moved in the first place. I could have sworn it was closer to the driveway when I pulled in. I had to be imagining things, I thought. There was no way it could move, let alone move that far. I made my way to the kitchen to make myself a sandwich. Fatigue and hunger was probably just getting the better of me. After constructing my snack, I walked back into my office and sat down on my chair, ready to continue my work. I entered a new set of numbers, but something told me to look out my window once more. So, I did. I glanced outside, and what I saw almost knocked me out of my chair. The snowman was only a few feet away from my house, facing my window. I could feel my heart ache in my chest as I struggled to regain my bearings. I got up from my chair and walked over to the window itself and looked closer. It was definitely standing there. It had definitely moved. I was unsure what to think. The kid or kids who had built it obviously were still around and wanted to mess with me, but moving such a large mass of snow had to be difficult. I grabbed my coat, put my shoes on, and opened my door, ready to give these kids a piece of my mind for messing with me. But when I did, my hand remained glued to the handle as I stared agape at the snowman. He was now back in his original spot near my driveway, as if he hadn't moved in the slightest. That was impossible, I thought. I knew what I saw, and there was absolutely no way it could have made it back to that spot in such a short amount of time. I looked around my porch for any sign of the troublemakers, but there was nobody to be found. I gave one more apprehensive glance at the snowman before returning inside. I went back to my office and drew the curtains on my window. I tried my best not to think about it, and simply focused on my work. Upon entering the last bit of information into the spreadsheet, I finally looked at the clock. 2 hours had passed. I printed out the data and placed it in my briefcase. The sun had long since set outside, and I thought about taking a peek out of the window, but decided against it. I walked into my living room and turned on the TV instead. Not 2 seconds after I sat down on my couch was there a knock at my door. Annoyed at the timing, I grunted as I peeled myself off from my seat. I gripped the knob, but at that moment, something inside me was telling me not to open the door. I waited for a moment. Then, against my instinct, I opened it. A flurry of snow gusted inside, but there was no one standing there. I took a step outside and looked around. Nothing. I looked over to where the snowman was. Nothing. Wait. The snowman was gone. I scanned through the darkness, looking for anything resembling a snowman, but it was nowhere to be found. Maybe the kids took the snowman to bother someone else finally. I promptly shut the door and decided it was time for bed. I shut off the TV and entered my bedroom. After getting changed and brushing my teeth, it was time to put this day to rest. I was awoken not long after drifting off to a knocking. Once I realized where the knocking was coming from, I didn't want to move from my bed. I could feel ice starting to form in my veins as I checked the clock on my nightstand. It was 3 a.m. The knocking sounded once more, and I felt my body shudder as I kept my eyes fixed on my bedroom window. The glass vibrated as another knock sounded. I silently crept out of my bed and over to the window. I gripped the edge of the curtains and gently peeked behind them. The snowman was standing there, mere inches from my window. I was nervous, but more so angry that these kids were still continuing this act. Then, I watched in pure terror as the snowman's head began to turn on its own. It slowly twisted to the right until its black eyes were locked with mine. I felt my stomach rise in my throat and shut the curtain immediately. I sprinted over to my phone and called the police. When they asked me what the problem was, I had to come up with something other than a living snowman. I told them that some kids had been playing a prank on me, and I asked if they could send a car to check it out. They agreed, and not long after that, there was a knock at my door. The officer was rubbing his hands together to stay warm when I answered the door. I explained the whole snowman situation, excluding the part where its head moved. The officer nodded and took a walk around my property. 10 minutes passed before the officer returned and told me there were no signs of anyone. And more importantly, no signs of any snowman. I thanked him for taking the time to check it out and he left. I stayed up the rest of the night until the sun rose. I wanted to leave for work early just so I didn't have to deal with this anymore. I showered, got dressed, grabbed my briefcase, and stepped outside. The snow had stopped falling by this point. I looked around nervously, expecting to see that snowman somewhere, but there was no sign of him in my yard. I rushed over to my car, got inside, and started it up. After a moment of relief, I glanced over, and that's when I saw it. The snowman was now sitting in my neighbor's front yard. I drove away, spinning the tires in the process. As I sped down the street, I couldn't be certain, but it looked as though one of the arms on the snowman raised up and down, waving at me as I raced down the road. I have no idea where it came from, or how it can even move like that. But I think I'm gonna stay at a hotel for a couple of days until it leaves for good. If you ever see a snowman in your front yard that you didn't make, keep an eye on it, because it'll probably be keeping its eyes on you.